One week, propeller-driven fighters roar across Europe and the Pacific, engaging in tight-turn dogfights like mechanical knights locked in aerial duels. And the next week, almost without warning, something new slices through the clouds. No propeller, no growling piston engine, just a clean, high-pitched whistle followed by a streak of metal moving so fast that pilots barely understand what they saw. It was the birth of the jet age. But the twist is that this revolutionary leap didn't belong to only one nation. It wasn't simply Germany and its Me-262, or Britain fielding the Gloster Meteor, or the United States scrambling to catch up, or Japan desperately trying to build anything that might keep them in the war. Instead, what unfolded between 1937 and 1945 was one of the most intense, secretive, and technologically risky development races in the history of warfare, one in which each side experienced breakthroughs, missed opportunities, and produced aircraft so advanced they seemed like visitors from another century. And the real question isn't just who built the first jet, it's who built the better one, what advantages each faction brought to the race, and why some of the most advanced machines of the war barely appear in history books today. Before we begin this deep dive into the forgotten jet programs of Germany, Japan, Britain, the United States, Italy, and the Soviet Union, programs full of sabotage, desperation, industrial collapse, and flashes of engineering genius, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and comment which WW2 jet you think was the most underrated, because it really helps the channel grow and keeps documentaries like this alive. World War II is often described as the era of the great propeller-driven legends, the Spitfires, Mustangs, Zeros, and Messerschmitts that defined dogfighting for an entire generation. But behind the roaring engines and iconic silhouettes, a quieter revolution was already taking shape. It began even before the war officially started, when a handful of engineers scattered across Britain, Germany, Italy, and later America and Japan began working on strange new turbines, experimental compressors, and compact mechanical parts that looked more like plumbing equipment than the future of flight. None of them fully understood that they were laying the foundation for machines that would dominate the next century of aviation. Yet despite sharing this early vision, the playing field was anything but even. Germany entered the war with extraordinary aerodynamic expertise, but suffered from material shortages and political interference. Britain had arguably the best early jet engine design, but lacked the industrial scale to push rapid mass production. The United States possessed enormous industrial capacity, but arrived late to the race. Japan had brilliant engineers, but almost no resources left by the time their prototypes flew. Italy and the Soviet Union had bold ideas, but not enough time or infrastructure to bring them to maturity. Yet all of these nations, regardless of their circumstances or limitations, pushed forward and attempted to build jet aircraft. Some succeeded spectacularly, others produced single prototypes, others built experimental machines so unusual or so ahead of their time that they seemed almost fictional. Germany is often seen as the early leader in this jet race, the nation that produced the Me-262, the Arado 234, the Heinkel 280, the He-178, and numerous late-war experimental designs. Germany entered the war with two things that set them apart: exceptional aerodynamics and an aggressive belief that radical new technology could change the war's outcome. But this same belief would eventually create a dangerous imbalance between ambition and reality. The first spark of Germany's jet journey began with the Heinkel He-178, the world's first aircraft to fly solely under turbojet power. On August 27, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland, this small, compact machine took to the air and proved that jet propulsion wasn't just a theory. It worked. The He-178 wasn't fast or militarily meaningful, but it was a historic milestone. The problem was that almost no one in German military leadership cared. With the Luftwaffe focused on immediate wartime gains and quick victories, the He-178 demonstration was met with polite applause, followed by indifference. This moment of dismissiveness would become a pattern in German aviation, brilliant engineering overshadowed by short-sighted leadership and bureaucratic rivalry. The next aircraft, the He-280, should have changed everything. It was the first purpose-built jet fighter design in history, flying as early as 1941 and outmaneuvering Germany's best piston aircraft in mock dogfights. It was ready for development before the Me-262, and had it been mass-produced, Germany might have fielded jet fighters years earlier. Yet political infighting and engine delays doomed the project. The Luftwaffe wanted Messerschmitt, not Heinkel, to develop the future of jet combat, and the fragile early engines used in the He-280 proved troublesome. In another timeline, the He-280 becomes the world's first operational jet fighter, rewriting the aerial battles of 1942 and 1943. But in our world, it slipped into obscurity. Then came the aircraft that has become the symbol of Nazi jet technology, the Me-262 Schwalbe. Sleek, fast, deadly, and frighteningly modern, the Me-262 flew faster than any Allied fighter and could outrun anything that tried to chase it. It accelerated harder, climbed better, and introduced a new kind of aerial warfare in which propeller-driven planes suddenly felt obsolete. But the Me-262 carried its share of crippling flaws. Its engines were notoriously unreliable, lasting only 10 to 25 flight hours before needing replacement. Rapid throttle changes caused compressor failures. Germany lacked trained pilots capable of handling such advanced aircraft. Fuel shortages crippled operations, and Adolf Hitler's catastrophic insistence on turning the Me-262 into a bomber wasted months of precious time. The Me-262 was a brilliant aircraft trapped in a collapsing system. It wasn't the perfect war winner many imagine, but it was undeniable proof that Germany had entered the jet age early and aggressively. What most people don't realize is that the Me-262 was only one of many jet aircraft Germany was building. Many never made it beyond prototypes, yet each one reveals how deeply Germany invested in jet propulsion. The Arado 234 Blitz became the world's first operational jet bomber, a sleek, futuristic aircraft that Allied fighters struggled to intercept. Used primarily for reconnaissance, it produced some of the most daring aerial photographs of the war, including images of the Normandy beachhead that stunned Allied commanders. The Horten Ho 229, a flying wing jet made mostly of wood, was decades ahead of its time, featuring a naturally low radar signature and aerodynamics so advanced that post-war American engineers studied its design. Late-war paper projects, such as the Junkers EF-128, the coal-powered Lippisch P-11A, and the FW Wolf T-183, an aircraft that would influence early Soviet jet designs, demonstrate how frantically Germany tried to outpace the Allies, even as its industrial base collapsed. Germany's story in the jet race is one of brilliance weakened by bad timing and worse leadership. They had the head start, the aerodynamic expertise, and the sheer creative daring needed to advance jet technology faster than anyone else. But they lacked unity, long-term strategy, materials, fuel, test pilots, and above all, time. Other nations watched Germany's experiments, learned from their mistakes, and began developing their own jets in secret. And the race soon expanded far beyond Germany, spreading into Britain, the United States, Japan, the Soviet Union, and Italy, each of them chasing the same goal through vastly different circumstances. While Germany pushed forward with impossible urgency, the Allies followed very different paths. Paths slower at first, but far more stable, sustainable, and ultimately decisive. Among them, Britain stood alone as the early pioneer of jet propulsion, thanks largely to one man whose name should be as famous as Einstein or Tesla, yet rarely is, Frank Whittle. Years before the war began, Whittle sketched out the blueprint for a turbojet engine in a notebook, envisioning a machine that produced thrust through combustion and compression rather than spinning propellers. But like so many scientific geniuses ahead of their time, he struggled to convince the establishment. The British Air Ministry didn't grasp the potential of his idea, and Whittle spent years fighting for funding, manufacturing support, and recognition. By the time Britain realized he was right, Germany had already begun flying prototypes. Yet, despite starting with fewer resources and less initial enthusiasm, Whittle designed an engine that would become the foundation of almost all post-war jet propulsion, the centrifugal flow turbojet. Unlike the fragile axial flow engines used by Germany, Whittle's design was sturdier, easier to produce, and more reliable, even though it generated less thrust. This distinction, durability versus raw power, would shape the entire jet race moving forward. Britain's first jet aircraft, the Gloster E-2839, took to the skies on May 15, 1941, making the UK the second nation to fly a jet after Germany. The flight was a quiet, controlled success, lacking the drama of Germany's HE-178, but demonstrating a technology that actually worked without constant mechanical failure. Britain's first operational jet fighter, the Gloster Meteor, entered service in 1944. Unlike the Me-262, it was not the fastest jet of the war, nor the most fearsome, nor the sleekest, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and far safer for new jet pilots. The Meteor's first combat missions weren't glamorous dogfights at high altitude. Instead, they involved hunting down the V-1 flying bombs that Germany launched at British cities. The Meteor proved incredibly effective at this task, using its jet speed to intercept the unmanned rockets before they struck civilian areas. Although the Meteor and the Me-262 never met in combat, a fact often forgotten in popular retellings, their existence on opposite sides of the conflict marked a quiet turning point in warfare. Two nations, separated by ideology and circumstance, now flew machines that only a decade earlier belonged entirely to science fiction. But Britain's jet story contains an overlooked twist. While the Meteor gained the spotlight, a lesser-known fighter was in development, the de Havilland Vampire. With its twin-boom tail and compact fuselage, the Vampire flew in 1943 and was arguably more advanced in some respects than the Meteor. But production delays slowed its wartime impact. Still, the Vampire would go on to serve around the world for decades, eventually proving just how effective British engineering had become by the war's end. Even more surprising is the fact that Italy, often overlooked in discussions of wartime aviation, produced one of the world's earliest jet-powered aircraft, the Caproni Campini N1. While not a true turbojet, but rather a motor jet, the aircraft demonstrated Italy's willingness to experiment boldly with new forms of propulsion. It flew successfully in 1940 and even completed a high-profile Rome to Milan demonstration. Although the aircraft was too slow and inefficient to influence the war, its existence shows that Italy was far from technologically backward. It participated in the jet race at a time when even the United States had no flying prototypes. The United States, meanwhile, entered the jet race late but forcefully. American aviation in the early war years focused on mass production, building thousands of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Liberators rather than experimental aircraft. The U.S. did not yet need jets to maintain air superiority. But everything changed the moment Allied intelligence discovered the existence of the Me-262. Suddenly, generals and engineers realized that the future was approaching faster than expected. America wasted no time. They partnered with Britain to receive the Whittle WW2 jet engine, which they then built under license as the General Electric J-31. From this engine came America's first jet aircraft, the Bell P-59 Aerocomet. Unfortunately, the Aerocomet was shockingly underwhelming. It was slower than the best piston fighters, handled poorly, and suffered from reliability issues. Pilots joked that the only advantage the P-59 had in combat was that the enemy would be too surprised to see a jet. But this first attempt was not a failure. It was a stepping stone. The real American breakthrough arrived with the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Designed in an astonishing 143 days by Kelly Johnson's legendary Skunk Works team, the P-80 represented an engineering miracle. It was sleek, fast, stable, and aerodynamically efficient, and it demonstrated how quickly the U.S. aviation industry could shift into a high-tech mode when pushed. Although the P-80 only entered limited service before the war ended, it became the West's first truly modern jet fighter, one capable of setting speed records and challenging any aircraft in the world. And here we encounter one of the great what-if questions of aviation history. What if Germany, Britain, and the United States had all introduced large numbers of jets earlier in the war? Would dogfighting as we know it have changed forever? Would bomber offensives have been rendered impossible?
Would the Allied invasions of Europe have been delayed or rewritten? The truth is far more complex. Jets could change the air war, but they could not change the war itself. Germany lacked fuel, pilots, and industry. Britain lacked numbers. The US lacked time. And Japan, perhaps the most tragic participant in the jet race, lacked everything. Japan's entry into jet development came far later than Germany or Britain. And by the time their engineers began work on advanced propulsion systems, the empire was surrounded, running out of fuel and fighting a losing battle on every front. Yet, despite these conditions, Japan produced some of the most remarkable and least discussed jet aircraft of the war. Their most advanced design, the Nakajima Kikka, was directly inspired by the Me-268 and intended as a homeland defense interceptor. But the Kikka was not a clone. It was smaller, required shorter runways, and incorporated Japanese solutions suited for their shrinking industrial capacity. The first prototype flew on August 7, 1945, just one day after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The war ended before the aircraft could be refined or produced. Even more ambitious was the Mitsubishi J-8M, Shusui, a rocket-powered interceptor modeled on Germany's Me-163 Comet. The J-8M was incredibly fast but dangerously unstable. During its first test flight, the aircraft stalled shortly after takeoff and crashed, killing its pilot. Japan also worked on experimental jet fighters like the Nakajima Ki-201 Kar-U, a high-performance design that, had it flown, might have rivaled the Me-262. But none of these projects left the prototype stage. With factories bombed out, resources depleted, and the empire on the verge of collapse, Japan simply could not bring its jet dreams to life. The Japanese jet program stands today as a haunting example of innovation overshadowed by overwhelming strategic disaster. Their engineers were capable, creative, and often brilliant, but history gave them no time to succeed. As the war progressed, the Soviet Union also entered the jet race, though their programs remained fragmented and heavily reliant on captured German research. The Soviet Bi-1 rocket interceptor flew early in the war, but it was not a true jet and suffered from severe instability. Later Soviet attempts focused on adapting German engines and blueprints, laying the groundwork for post-war jets like the MiG-9 and eventually the MiG-15. The Soviets may not have produced jets during the war, but their rapid post-war success can be traced directly to the technologies they acquired in 1945. By the end of the war, the jet race had transformed from a scattered collection of experiments into a global technological revolution. Nations that had once dismissed jets as impractical now viewed them as essential. Aircraft that barely flew during the war would soon shape the Cold War. And the pilots who first tested these strange new machines, often risking their lives in unproven designs, would become the pioneers of a new aerial frontier. The stage was now set for the climax of this story, the moment when all these early experiments collided with the reality of the late war and the dawn of the jet age.
As 1944 turned into 1945, the jet race pivoted from experimentation to chaos. Every nation still in the war now confronted a stark and unavoidable truth. Whoever mastered jet technology first would shape not just the end of the conflict, but the entire future of global air power. Yet by this stage, the jet race was no longer a balanced competition. Germany had operational jets, but no fuel or factories. Britain had safe, reliable jets, but too few and too late to alter the strategic bombing campaigns already underway. The United States was building cutting-edge prototypes, but running out of time to deploy them. Japan was conducting test flights amid burning cities and collapsing infrastructure. And the Soviets were scavenging every piece of German technology they could reach, knowing that whatever they captured will become the foundation of their post-war air force. In this convergence of desperation, innovation, and collapse, the world entered the most dramatic phase of the jet age's birth. Germany's jets, particularly the Me-262, became central to the final battles over Europe. By early 1945, Allied bombers owned disguise. Entire German cities were being reduced to rubble as the Third Reich fought on in its death throes. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was running on fumes. Pilots were scarce, training programs were shattered, airfields were under constant attack. And yet, within this devastation, the Me-262 became a symbol of both hope and hopelessness. Pilots like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff led small groups of jet fighters in desperate attempts to push back the Allied advance. Their operations were technically impressive, intercepting bomber streams, diving through formations, and then sprinting away faster than Allied escorts could catch them, but strategically meaningless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and too few to shift anything at the macro level. One German pilot would later remark, "We had the future in our hands, but our fuel tanks were empty." The Me-262's most dramatic moment came during Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's last major air offensive, launched on January 1, 1945. The operation aimed to cripple Allied air power in Belgium and the Netherlands. But instead of smashing Allied airfields, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable pilots. The Me-262 units participated only marginally, and even their presence could not alter the crushing losses. By this point, the jet had become a tragic paradox, a machine capable of outrunning anything in the sky, flown by pilots who often had only a handful of jet training hours, launching from runways constantly strafed by P-51s and P-47s. The Me-262 proved that advanced technology cannot overcome the basic realities of war: logistics, numbers, and industrial capacity. Yet, even in defeat, the Me-262 exposed something shocking. Despite Allied dominance, none of the Allied nations had anything that could truly catch it in level flight. This revelation triggered immediate panic. The United States ordered that any Me-262 sighted on the ground must be destroyed before takeoff, and fighter pilots were assigned to airfield hunting roles, patrolling runways around Munich, Augsburg, and Berlin. Some pilots openly admitted that they never wanted to engage a Me-262 in a fair fight. Allied intelligence analysts wrote reports filled with phrases like unprecedented capability, operational leap, and engine design far beyond our current prototypes. The Allies won the war, but they knew instantly that Germany had won the first round of the jet technological race. While Germany fought its last breath with jets, Britain continued refining the Meteor. Although the Meteor never dueled with its German counterpart, it quietly proved something more important. Jets could be reliable, repeatable, and safe. This mattered far more in the long run than raw speed. The Meteor was not prone to catastrophic engine failures. Its pilots did not require extreme caution on the throttle. Its systems could be mass-produced using British industrial techniques. While Germany's jets pushed the theoretical limits of engineering, Britain's jets laid the foundation for practical application. The Meteor also achieved something historically significant. It shot down 13 V-1 flying bombs, making it the first Allied jet to score air-to-air victories. These kills demonstrated that jet fighters were not fragile prototypes. They could be integrated into actual wartime operations. The United States' jets, especially the Bell P-59, continued to disappoint in tests. Pilots hated the Aerocomet. Many said it handled like a jet-powered bathtub. Engineers knew that America needed something better, something far more refined. That pressure created the perfect environment for Lockheed's Skunk Works to flourish. The resulting P-80 Shooting Star stunned everyone who saw it fly. It exceeded expectations in speed, handling, and structural performance. Test pilots, like the legendary Tony LaVere, pushed the aircraft to its limits, reporting stability and speed unimaginable only a year earlier. Had the war continued, the P-80 would have entered combat against the Me-262. Many historians believe it would have matched or even surpassed Germany's jet in sustained combat scenarios due to its stability and acceleration. But fate intervened. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the Pacific War ended shortly after. Meanwhile, in Japan, the mood was entirely different. The empire was collapsing. American B-29 bombers roamed the sky uncontested. Cities were being incinerated.
And yet Japanese engineers worked feverishly to finish the Kikka and the Ki-201. These projects were not driven by dreams of victory, but by the desperate hope of building aircraft that could slow America's advance. The Kikka's first flight, smooth, clean, and successful, was a triumph, buried under apocalyptic defeat. There was no fuel, no time, no infrastructure left to build more. Japan's jets were tragedies in motion, brilliant on paper, promising in early tests, but doomed by circumstances no engineer could overcome. The Soviet Union, moving rapidly across Eastern Europe, seized every piece of German aviation technology they could find: airframes, engines, blueprints, unfinished projects, and even German scientists themselves. These materials became the backbone of the Soviet aviation leap after the war. The MiG-9 and MiG-15 were not simply Soviet designs. They were hybrid machines built on German jet principles and Soviet manufacturing philosophy. The Soviets had lost millions of soldiers and civilians, their cities reduced to ruins. But in one domain, they now saw an opportunity to leapfrog their rivals. The jet race had not ended with the war. It had only changed shape. As April 1945 approached, the Third Reich collapsed. Allied tanks rolled into German cities. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an organized force. In those final days, Me-262 pilots launched from makeshift runways between bomb craters, trying to defend a nation that no longer existed. Some pilots surrendered at their airfields. Others destroyed their aircraft to prevent capture. A few attempted one-way missions. One of the last Me-262 flights took place with a pilot taking off under artillery fire, dodging debris while engines screamed, only to return minutes later to find his airfield already under Allied control. The war's final jet scenes were not battles, they were fragments of tragedy. The climax came not in the skies, but on the ground. When Allied forces captured German jet bases like Lechfeld, they were stunned by what they found. Hangars filled with Me-262s, half-finished prototypes, engines stacked on the floor, research documents scattered across tables. Even damaged jets revealed aerodynamic concepts far ahead of anything the Allies had fully understood. American and British engineers were speechless. U.S. Colonel Harold Watson, leader of the Watson's Wizards recovery team, later called the German jet program the greatest technical jackpot of the war. These jets were not just trophies, they were blueprints for the next 40 years of aviation. And with this moment, the seizure of German technology, the jet race entered its final phase. Not a wartime race, but a post-war one. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union now possessed the seeds of technological futures born in the ashes of destroyed German hangars. Meanwhile, Japan's jet program became a historical footnote, buried by defeat. Italy's, similarly, disappeared beneath the weight of surrender. Germany's jets had arrived too late to save the Reich, but early enough to change the world. The end of the war marked the end of the first chapter of jet aviation, but the beginning of a new and far more consequential one.
Now the question was no longer who built the first jets or who deployed them in battle. It was who would use this knowledge to shape the coming Cold War, the new geopolitical order, and ultimately the modern world. As the war roared toward its conclusion, and the world stood on the brink of a technological transformation unlike anything in human history, the competition to build the fastest, most advanced jet aircraft reached a fever pitch. By 1944 and early 1945, jet propulsion was no longer a theoretical pursuit or a scientist's dream. It was now a brutal, urgent, last-minute gamble by empires fighting for survival. The Axis powers were desperate. Germany was collapsing. Japan's skies were burning under B-29 firestorms. The Allies were marching steadily toward victory, yet they were also acutely aware that the future of warfare, and perhaps global power itself, would be decided not by tanks or artillery, but by who could master jet flight first. The jet race was no longer simply about building a faster plane. It had become a symbolic struggle for scientific supremacy, national pride, strategic advantage,
and the right to define the dawn of the Cold War era. Germany had entered this final stretch of the race with the most momentum. Their Me-262 was already in the air, its swept wings slicing through the sky, shocking Allied pilots who had previously thought themselves untouchable. Even late-war Mustang and Thunderbolt aces admitted privately that the Me-262 scared them in ways they never expected. But as remarkable as the aircraft was, it carried the weight of a dying nation tied to a failing infrastructure. German refineries were bombed. Their factories were shattered. Skilled workers were gone. And inside the leadership, rivalry, mismanagement, and Hitler's disastrous insistence that the Me-262 be used as a bomber delayed every possibility of mass deployment. So Germany found itself in a tragic paradox. It had the world's most advanced jet engine, yet lacked the fuel, the time, and the stability to exploit it. Their technological brilliance was real, but so was their strategic collapse. In the jet race, Germany had run fastest early, but it was losing strength at the finish line. Japan, meanwhile, found itself fighting a different kind of race, not for dominance, but for survival. The Nakajima Kikka had taken off, showing that Japan had not only studied the Me-262, but had learnt from it, improved its structural design, and adapted the concept into something more practical for its geography and logistical constraints. And even beyond the Kikka, Japan was secretly testing the Mitsubishi J-8M rocket interceptor, a derivative of the German Me-163, proving that Japanese engineers were willing to push aeronautical physics far past the limits of safety. But with cities destroyed, aluminum scarce, and the U.S. Navy tightening its grip on the Pacific, Japanese jet development became a story of brilliant ambition crushed under overwhelming external pressure. The Kikka had the potential to become a dependable jet attacker. The J-8M had theoretical climb rates almost unmatched at the time. But history was not in Japan's favor. Time had expired before the world could see what these aircraft could truly do. The Allied powers, however, were entering the final act with the stability, resources, and industrial power needed to test, refine, and prepare for the post-war world. Britain had now deployed the Gloster Meteor operationally, shooting down V-1 flying bombs and escorting bombers with reliable, turbine-driven precision. The Meteor may not have been as fast or aerodynamic as the Me-262, but it worked, reliably, consistently, safely. Its engines were robust. Its landing gear did not collapse. Its turbines did not explode after 10 hours. And its production line, unlike Germany's, was organized, stable, and scalable. Britain had not only entered the jet age, they had created a system that allowed jet technology to flourish. Meanwhile, the United States, quietly but powerfully, was turning jet development into the next great industrial frontier. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star had already proven itself in testing, with speeds matching or surpassing the Me-262. But unlike its German rival, the P-80 was backed by factories, engineers, budgets, and fuel supplies untouched by enemy bombing. The U.S. had not simply built a jet fighter, they were preparing to mass-produce it. And as American engineers studied captured German turbines and airframes after the war, they understood something profound. Germany had shown what was possible, but the United States had the means to turn possibility into global air supremacy. As post-war interrogations, factory inspections, and intelligence reports began streaming in, the truth became clear to the Allies. The German jet program had been ahead in early innovation. No other country had fielded such advanced aerodynamic ideas so quickly, but it was hopelessly mismanaged. Engines that lasted 20 hours, supply chains in ruins, design disagreements, and political interference had crippled its long-term potential. Japanese jet research, while promising, had faced catastrophic shortages and impossible wartime circumstances. Britain had developed the safest and most refined engines during the war, but lacked the extreme aerodynamic risk-taking Germany had shown. And the United States, although slower to start, ended the conflict with the best overall mix of technology, stability, and industrial scale. Thus emerged the final, complicated truth. There was no single winner of the World War II jet race. Instead, Each nation had played a distinct role in shaping the jet age. Germany was the visionary, the bold pioneer, pushing boundaries with a dangerous, almost reckless urgency. Japan was the rapid learner, the adaptive engineer capable of turning borrowed ideas into improved, locally optimized designs. Britain was the stabilizer, the disciplined craftsman who created engines that the rest of the world would later rely on. And the United States was the finisher, the industrial giant who took all available knowledge, refined it, expanded it, and turned it into the global jet-powered superpower of the Cold War era. But if one must choose a victor, not based on wartime glory, but on long-term influence, the answer becomes clear. The nation that truly won the jet race was the one that had the resources, infrastructure, and momentum to carry jet aviation into the future, the United States. Not because it built the first jet or even the best wartime jet, but because it built the jets that defined the next half-century. F-86 Sabres, Century Series fighters, supersonic research aircraft, and eventually the entire technological ecosystem that powered NATO air superiority. Yet this outcome does not diminish the contributions of the Axis or allied nations. Without German innovation, the U.S. turbine industry would have been decades slower. Without British engine stability, early American jets would have been repeatedly grounded. Without Japanese emergency creativity, many aerodynamic shortcuts later used in rocket interceptors and high-altitude fighters would have remained undiscovered. The jet race was not a singular competition. It was a fragmented, chaotic, multinational scramble that ended up constructing the entire foundation of modern aviation.